While this channel is mostly about action figure collecting, because, well, I am an action figure collector myself, one could even say a lifelong action figure collector, I'm a fan of, well, play in general, which is really what drew me to the toy industry, and one of the reasons I've stayed as a toy maker for over 20 years. I love all things play, and I especially love bringing play to children. While I collect in my personal life, and I've had the privilege of working on action figure lines that are more adult collector in nature, I think when you can create a timeless toy that lives generation to generation, that children engage with, that becomes part of our culture, that's really that's the Oscar, that's the antithesis, that's the end goal, is to make something that's going to be loved, beloved, but also is just works for any generation and carries play forward. In an interesting way, whenever I'm in a new situation, meeting new people, or leading, well, I guess when you have a meeting, you have icebreakers. What I do, instead of everyone going around and saying, like, oh, what state were you born in, or what's your favorite breakfast cereal, instead, as a form of icebreaking, I guess that's a term, I like to always ask people what their favorite toy was, and inevitably people's faces just light up, because who doesn't love describing their favorite toy? It's one of the reasons I find it works so well for getting to know people at new meetings. And you usually hear about the typical ones. Every once in a while, someone says something that throws you for a loop, like they, love the game Othello or something. What? I love the game Othello. But, yeah, of course you're going to get the really top brands that everyone knows and loves. Those tend to be favorites for the very good reason that they were highly popular. All right, so connecting back to what we started this video with, about toys being classic and living generation to generation, when you're applying that to an action figure specifically, since that tends to be the type of toy we talk about on this channel, and it's my favorite type of toy, well, there's a lot of things that have to go into that. Of course, there's going to be toys that take you into the world of, whatever IP it is, intellectual property, but really we're talking about a toy that has to be child-friendly. So yes, of course there are toys for adult collectors, and we all love these, but to truly define something as, say, the greatest action figure of all time, it has to be timeless. I think it has to have a life of its own, meaning it has to be able to be universally recognized when you put it in a child's hand. And then third, it has to be an avatar for the imagination. It has to have the child inspired to see themselves as this toy. So while some things could be thought of as an action figure, like Mr. Potato Head, that's much more of a game versus a action figure where a child sees us and wants to actually be. Okay, well, maybe not this one. This is a bad example. But I think actually using a bad example is a way to jump forward and say, what is truly the greatest action figure based on that criteria? So child-friendly, timeless, life of its own, avatar for the imagination. All right, well, let's kind of go through the decades, starting with G.I. Joe, universally recognized pretty much as the first action figure, but really this is just a doll line for boys. It is doll play that has been put onto, well, basically military fantasy. And while you could say that there's definitely the idea of an avatar, feeling that you'd want to be these characters, there's not as much timelessness because this type of toy feels very dated. While G.I. Joe did introduce the Kung Fu grip, which is really what makes it an action figure and not a doll, meaning the ability to hold items in its hand, or specifically weapons in the case of G.I. Joe, it really isn't one that, much like later on the Steve Austin the $6 Million Man toy, they're both, G.I. Joe and this, are examples of toys that were great at the time, but don't really have that timeless nature. If you put this toy right here into a child's hands, one, they're going to be like, who is this character? Because this is not a brand that has lived on. But two, it's not aspirational because there's no frame of reference. Well, I guess it's kind of, in a way, the same thing. It hasn't found a way to enter culture beyond fondly remembering the Spy Eye play action feature. So while, yes, this toy and G.I. Joe are very significant in the history of action figures, I don't think we can award them greatest action figure of all. Continuing along in our timeline of action figure history brings us to something like Stretch Armstrong, which, again, can you define this as an action toy, a game, or a figure? That's what also makes it a little hard to name something like this greatest action figure of all time. While it had a really innovative feature, so this is more of a feature-based toy than an action figure, it can't really be said to be, yeah, the greatest. It's thought to be timeless. It's been brought back a few times, but hasn't really gained that mass audience that it had when it first hit. It was kind of a one-hit wonder. Another example of that is the Evel Knievel stunt cycle. Huge when it first came out, really fun, very easy to play, almost defined the figure plus vehicle play pattern. It came with the figure, the vehicle, and the mechanism to actually start the stunts up, rev up the cycle. So much like Stretch Armstrong, this was huge when it hit, but it hasn't really lived on. You don't see kids today running to get an Evel Knievel stunt cycle, so again, that whole timeless aspect of categorizing, or at least naming, what defines the greatest action figure of all time, brings this one down, and it's more of a niche on the belt of pop culture. And, we can blaze through the 70s with some other lines like Big Jim, but while significant at the time, it really just was resurrecting the G.I. Joe play pattern, but applying it to non-military aspirational aspects. So, Avatar for the imagination, but not timeless. Mego, of course, has to be mentioned, but also very similar to G.I. Joe, this was doll play for boys, and while it brought superheroes and licensed IP, the timeless aspect is knocked off the shelf because current Mego lines just don't sell to kids. They sell to collectors. You can see them at the collector wall in the back of electronics, but when they try to sell these in the main aisle, it doesn't work. They're just not seen as something today's kids are interested in, so that knocks these off the list. Heading from the 70s into the 80s, we run into two lines that are very similar to each other, which is, of course, the Real American Hero G.I. Joe line, which premiered in 82, and then Star Wars, which came out a few years prior. Both of these lines I loop together because they're the same play pattern. They are figure plus vehicle. Not the way it was with Evel Knievel, where you needed the two of them to pull off stunts, but rather the action figures were accessories for the vehicles, especially in the way the line was originally conceived. It was thought kids were going to want to buy vehicles, not figures. Now, eventually, that kind of reversed itself, where the figures became the main thing people bought, but in order to truly get the play pattern out of a 3 3/4 Star Wars or G.I. Joe figure, you really needed a vehicle. These are smaller figures, which is why they tend to not work as much of what's thought of as open-ended play, versus when you put them in the vehicle, that's where the avatar aspect comes from, because you can then harness the power of that vehicle. You are now flying an X-Wing or driving a Cobra water moccasin. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't familiar with that one before I snatched the video. So yeah, once you take away the vehicles from a line like G.I. Joe or vintage Star Wars, well, not so much. Now, Transformers is another interesting one that followed on the heels of Star Wars and G.I. Joe in the States, because, well, it was a Japanese toy that was just rebranded, and while it's cool, it really is just a puzzle box, like Rubik's Cube. You're transforming something from one form to another, and that's what the play pattern is. It's not open-ended play or doinky-doink play as much as puzzle play. Now, of course, the characters are very engaging, but even the lead character, Optimus Prime, is not really someone kids see themselves as. He's much more of your buddy that goes on adventures with you. He's a robot, so he will take care of you, he will protect you, he may even be seen as a father figure, which is really how Optimus Prime connects with kids. So, because you lose that whole avatar concept of seeing yourself as the toy, well, Transformers is off the list too. Alright, so this lets us head into superhero times when, after Mego and Secret Wars, well, that brought superheroes into the toy aisle. And Iron Man, Batman, and Spider-Man by far are the best-selling toys, well, superhero toys, that is, and that's specifically because of the qualities that make up who they are, their DNA, if you will. And there's a reason for that, because there are obviously more and more superheroes in the mainstream now, more than ever, thanks to things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and DC movies, etc., etc. But the three of these these characters bubble up to the top. Spider-Man, because he emulates the way kids move and play. Kids like to climb, crawl, and swing. That's the way children actually play. So Spider-Man is like a kid himself. Iron Man and Batman, on the other hand, are basically two sides of the same coin. A self-made man, a person who, basically a rich person who dresses up as a superhero, but because of that can craft outfits and suits for any need. Batman has literally had decades of a head start on Iron Man, but it's literally the same thing. Whether you're putting on a cowl or a suit of armor, it represents a self-made man, a person any kid can be, who can then create whatever they need for any battle. It's a concept baked into the DNA of both Batman and Iron Man that works so well. All right, so we obviously haven't talked about a few brands, things like He-Man or... Now, there are a few toy properties of the action figure aisle I've kind of skipped over. WWE, starting lineup. Those are more from real life. I'm really talking about fantasy play here, so for those of you who are WWE fans. Now, Turtles, I could absolutely make an argument for, and I made a whole video about why it appeals to kids. But, well, and I know I may be biased from my time working on it, I actually do think that Masters of the Universe, that He-Man potentially is the greatest action figure ever made, and I can make the case for that using all of the criteria, well, laid out. Now, as far as the aspirational nature and the whole avatar for the imagination, that was baked in from day one, while originally the powers, or rather the source of He-Man's powers, were going to come from his outfit, which actually would have been him more almost in that G.I. Joe Big Jim dress-up doll category. Because that changed from the original concept, so no longer was he powered by what he was wearing, but rather his sword. And a sword is by far the most aspirational role-play toy for kids. So already you have a hero whose main weapon is already the most enjoyed, I guess you could say, aggressive object for young boys. And that sword, and here's the key, not only is it the source of his power, but it's the transformation. So He-Man literally goes from you to him. And that, to me, is what puts him outside of the other action figures as far as greatest possible character, because that Billy Batson Captain Marvel effect, but it's generated again from a sword, which is a very, very aspirational object. It basically means anyone can be Superman. Anyone can battle Superman. You don't have to be from, another galaxy or born special. You just have to have access to that sword. And besides swords, He-Man also has access to technology. Hence, he rides a motorcycle. Hence, he drives all sorts of very techno-oriented vehicles. And, obviously a big part of this is the Jack Kirby influence on the original line. You can see the video I made on that. I'll link it afterwards. But this really makes He-Man stand out, because while he has that concept that he could be anything, like G.I. Joe or Big Jim, depending on the outfit he's in, all of his powers and his ability to even change those outfits and generate new outfits comes from that sword. And I can't downplay that, and well, not enough or more, because when you have an aspirational object, a sword, that is then the source of your powers and your transformation, well, it makes anyone want to be and can be those characters. And this is why I have such high hopes for Origins, because if it can succeed at retail and get kids back into the line, or continue to be into Masters of the Universe, then it fulfills the need and the categories of the form factor, timeless nature, and the avatar for the imagination. All right, so that's my case. I know that I've worked on He-Man, but I've also worked on Star Wars and WWE and many, many other brands. I just happen to think that it checks off those necessary boxes. What do you think? Am I totally off? Is there another line I missed that I didn't even talk about? Let me know in the comments below. What is your greatest action figure line of all time? I'd love to know.